So I gotta warn you all, I know there's a lot of you out there that love this run, but I've got some controversial opinions. Before we get some angry viewers to smash that dislike button, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island for more videos on comics new and old. And also be sure to check out this handy playlist to watch the rest of Grading the Avengers. In the mid-90s, after an unprecedented run of short-term writers, things had finally changed with the arrival of Bob Harras, who would take over the series starting with Avengers number 334. Much like how Roy Thomas dominated the late 60s and early 70s, or how Roger Stern took on a huge chunk of the 1980s. Bob Harras is sort of the final chapter in that trilogy, with him largely dominating the Avengers in the 1990s. Like the other two, it is his era most people think of when it comes to Avengers comics from this particular decade. Even if Harras had a lot of guest spots and other writers, most notably one of his predecessors, Fabian Nicienza, filling in on occasion. We've been getting a lot of feedback as Grading Avengers has come out from our audience about how much Bob Harras' run means to them. Which has sure been interesting for me, as for the record, all these grades were largely finalized before the first video ever came out of the series. Harras had a huge effect on the Avengers, what the team looked like, and how their stories were told for his decade and far beyond. And he did so not just while writing the series, but in many years to come, as a pretty substantial and powerful editor for Marvel and later DC. Unfortunately, I do not have that fond of an opinion of Bob Harras for that reason. Under his time while working on the editorial board of DC, there are certainly a lot of positive things that can be said about him, but his legacy is stained by that of questionable decisions, most especially orbiting around the New 52 line of comics, and far worse than that, a hostile climate he enabled in an industry that has too often sheltered abusive or even dangerous individuals. Bob Harras and others with power like him too often protected these criminals, because that's what they are, while endangering their victims in the process. And his name should never really be mentioned again without keeping that behavior in mind. So I will never like or respect Bob Harras as a person. That ship has sailed a long time ago. But I sure wasn't about to let any of that affect my opinion of the Avengers comics he wrote, especially before any of this stuff had happened. That's especially true given that people like this run for a reason. There's a lot to like here. Reading these Avengers books leaves me feeling strangely nostalgic, even though this was my first time going through these particular Avengers books properly. Harris's new and stable roster allowed him to focus on fun characters like Cersi, Crystal, Hercules, and Black Widow. It's a great roster overall, featuring a ton of characters we had never really gotten nearly enough of in the Avengers up until this point. And they all look amazing thanks to the artwork of Steve Epting. The Avengers have never really had any consistent sense of uniform to them before this era, but the selective use of it with a few characters really brings out a unique look to this particular Avengers run. It gives this time period of Avengers comics this certain flair and visual style that really makes it stand out from other series, which up until now largely had a very similar and consistent look and feel to it between the 60s all the way up until this point in the 90s. Epting's artwork feels like the first big change. A look that's dynamic and full of life in a way that, as much as I love past Avengers artists, reading these books is like entering into a whole new world. This run marks the beginning of a sort of transitional period between the older art, done entirely by hand, to the newer, more modern, computer-enhanced stuff. And it leaves me with this wonderful feeling of it just existing robustly in the world of Marvel Comics. Some characters like Black Widow are drawn in a way that deliberately evokes Jack Kirby's original artwork for the Avengers, while others like Hercules are designed completely differently and feature at least the idea of that Avengers uniform I was talking about earlier. Even though one is kind of bringing us back to the old and the other is trying out something new, both work for me, even when they're being applied to the same team in the same run. It's got this loose quality to the art that really frees it up to explore things in a way I don't feel past Avengers were able to for one reason or another. I also appreciate how consistently Harras keeps these books feeling like Avengers comics instead of 90s era comics that vaguely resemble the Avengers. That does actually happen later on to this series. Like Stern, Harras represents good stewardship of the team and its creative integrity. However, unlike Stern, I sadly have a lot of problems with this run. The biggest issue is by far how boring and dry I find the actual stories. Every time I tried to dig into one of these plots, I found myself loving the warm and fuzzy feelings I got from the art and the characters, only for that to slowly ebb away as each and every one of Bob Harras' stories just drags on across so many issues in these little crossover runs. Often made with heavy collaboration with other writers like Fabian Nicienza, Harras' story arcs are usually well regarded, most especially Operation Galactic Storm. A lot of our viewers were really excited for me to review it and other comics made around this time. I'm afraid, however, I really don't like these books. In fact, Operation Galactic Storm might be the best example of what I'm describing. At 19 issues long, it sure starts out strong and interesting enough, but by the end I'm just shocked that the story is still going on, while the plot itself is not nearly big or interesting enough to actually feature that much comic book content. I didn't find anything exciting or compelling about this story, and certainly not enough to justify nearly 20 issues of content. If you happen to be a fan of that story or anything else we're talking about today, great. All I can tell you is that for whatever reason, I got nothing out of it on just about any level plot-wise. Seeing all the new artwork and characters we'd be getting to know really had me hopeful of what was to come. So I found it very disappointing to see the rest of the story essentially tread water and waste all this solid artwork and the excellent roster. It also really bothers me just how much Bob Harras completely abandoned the more progressive moves of the series made by Larry Hama and Roger Stern. Rage and Captain Marvel were effectively abandoned for good around this point. Though I said that was pretty much always going to happen once Larry Hama left the series after coming in for only a short period of time, it's still frustrating to see. It's very annoying to have the Avengers openly confront its own history with race, only to forget about the notion entirely and immediately after bringing up the discussion to begin with. It's a fair thing for me to complain about because they're the ones who brought it up. In many ways, everything about Bob Harras' Avengers serves as a terrible omen of modern comics, thanks to the future Harras kind of represents, as he would become a very powerful figure in both Marvel and later DC. Excellent artwork often waylaid by interesting stories that get dragged out way too long, lip service towards a more progressive and diverse roster while abandoning it at the first opportunity and never really giving it a chance to begin with, the warm and comfortable nostalgic feelings that often disguise stories that lack any sort of depth. That is every bad habit of the modern age. It's for that reason I kind of found Bob Harras' books very interesting and very worth reading. They are so prophetic of the new 52 and the future of both Marvel and DC in general. Given how Harras was so heavily involved in deciding what writers and artists got chances at both companies, and he very much shaped the trajectory of said companies in the modern age, it makes sense to me that a lot of the stuff he drifted towards as a writer also informed a lot of his decisions later as an editor. Anyone, for good reason, is going to hire and promote people with similar creative sensibilities as themselves. For this reason, these books are kind of really cool to read for any comic book fan who might like to learn how comics came to be what they are in the 21st century. But, if you're checking out these books for that reason, rather than what the creators actually intended, which is the only line of recommendation I can give you, I largely don't count it in the favor for the book's final grade. Harras' Avengers have a lot of problems that leave it at least somewhat in the middle. It gets a very conditional recommendation as a cool little tidbit of comic book history, but that's it. That's all I can give you. While worth reading for a select few for that reason, maybe, and worth remembering as part of Avengers history, definitely. Otherwise, it's not really something that stands well against the test of time, or most importantly, what determines the final grade. How it stands against the rest of Avengers comics. For that reason, fans of this era shouldn't be too disappointed with that grade. The way things worked out, a C- isn't really terrible, but instead feels very average. It's just that Avengers comics kind of set a high standard for themselves, and this run doesn't meet that standard, at which point, because so many runs do, this grade drops quite quickly. When it comes to Avengers comics, that kind of grade generally means an era with a lot of pros and cons, leaving a very mediocre picture overall. And if some of my words in this review have come across as harsh for fans, I gotta tell you, I really didn't enjoy reading any of these books, so one could argue it did quite well in spite of that fact. I could appreciate and find a lot of value in the books, even if overall it was a pretty bleak reading experience beyond all the interesting little behind-the-scene details and tidbits I happened to notice. I actually don't think it speaks that well of these story arcs that what I thought about most when reading this was the behind-the-scenes aspects rather than the actual stories themselves. And I'm afraid the more I learn about the person, the more I find out about Bob Harras, the more I feel nothing about him was ever all that great. Broadly speaking, I'm glad the man seems to be no longer working with either of the big two companies and won't be in the future, as his legacy, in my opinion, should not be considered a positive one. He's really not that different than Dan Didio. But don't worry guys, next time on Grading the Avengers, Bob Harras isn't actually going away, and I'll still be able to show you what true greatness looks like, so there's some consolation in all of this, but maybe not as much as y'all might hope. Still, stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Grading the Avengers.